This is the Career Foundation's Future at Work podcast and web series with our host, Evelyn Akselrod, as she explores critical topics affecting the workforce and workplace. Each episode, we focus on new and emerging trends across high-growth industries, including technology, sales and services, healthcare, finance, and the skilled trades. Visit us at www.careerfoundation.com to learn more.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Career Foundation's Future at Work webinar and podcast series. My name is Evelyn with the Career Foundation, and today we'll be taking on the second part of a three-part equity series looking at diversity and inclusion in the workplace and the workforce. Today, we'll be focused on gender equity and the impact of COVID on women's economic inclusion. I'm so excited to be joined by two brilliant leaders in gender equity. I'm joined by Anjum Sultana from the YWCA and the co-author of a feminist economic recovery plan for Canada. And I'm also joined by Jessica Ketwaroo-Green, who is working hard to raise awareness of the shadow pandemic and the serious implications on the lives of women. So welcome, friends, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have this discussion. Of course, you've been doing way more than this little description provides. You are the doers of extraordinary things. So I'd love if you could jump in and get us started telling us a little bit about you. Anjum, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us and creating the space for this dialogue. It is so important. And I'm glad to be here. I guess to share a bit about myself. So I work at WYCA Canada, which is the nation's largest and oldest gender equity organization. This year is our 150th anniversary. And I mention this because unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, this is not the first time our organization has dealt with a pandemic. We've dealt with the 1917 flu that hit Canada. And so we've kind of seen what happens when a crisis hits and why it's important to invest in community-based organizations such as ours to get us through this crisis. Before I started at the YWCA, my background was actually in public health and health equity. So I worked for a number of years at a think tank that focused on the social determinants of health. And I would say that background is really essential for how I've been thinking about this pandemic, because when I think about what has been saving us in this crisis, it's been the social determinants of health. And I really see the importance of prevention, right? That's what public health teaches us. So as we're kind of going through a public health crisis, I'm leaning on those expertise and that skill set, but also looking at it through a gender lens, through an intersectional lens. And I'll say also what I bring to the table, and I try to keep in mind in the work that I do, is my own lived experience and my own social location as an immigrant, as a young woman, as a South Asian Canadian. And I really think about those pieces when I think about public policy and who is and isn't in the room.
Okay, so thank you, Anjum. So now we have Jessica. Jessica, please tell us a little bit about you.
Eve, gosh, where do I start? I think that I like to start with my sort of educational background. So I went to Ryerson, studied political science, was there for 5 years, graduated 2.5 years ago. I can't remember. I guess what happens when you get old is that you lose track of the days. But since my undergraduate degree and, the 3 years thereafter, I've been extremely involved in women's advocacy through a variety of means, but mostly I've been focused on doing systems work and doing policy work and changing sort of the mechanisms which impact the day-to-day lives of women, and making some more broader, more community-focused change versus an individualized approach to seeing women's gender equality. And so I think that's where most of my work has focused. I'm sure in a lot of my work, I've also been extremely interested in policy, as mentioned, but also research and getting a better understanding from a Canadian perspective around how gender inequity sort of manifests itself within a Canadian context. I think that a lot of the information that we rely on within Canada is based on statistics and data that comes from the US, unfortunately. And so a lot of my current work right now is focused on data collection, particularly disaggregated data collection, and bringing that into our Canadian policymaking process to ensure that the policies and programs that we're designing to support women actually do so, and they're responding to evidence-based approaches that we're finding through Canadian research. And so much of my focus and much of my work is wrapped up in those two ideas, but also I like to always bring my lived experience as a racialized woman to the table and speaking about that. And when I'm in or engaged in processes which involve policy or that involve research, I do like to advocate on behalf of my community, recognizing that I don't represent every single voice in my community, but I do have a firm understanding through both lived experience and what research I have done around what are the experiences, particularly of Black women in Canada, and how we can address that, how we can address sort of the broader Caribbean or African diaspora within Canada, but as well as how can we support women. And I like to bring those two intersecting identities that I carry into all of the work that I do. And as we go on today, I'm sure that we'll definitely see that prevalent in our discussion.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. You're doing brilliant work, and I've been following both of you for so long, and every time I see something from you and I learn it and I digest it, I feel smarter for it. So thank you so much for that. So Anjum, I want to go back to you, and I'd love for you to talk to us about some of the work that you and findings that you found through your research and your report about the economic impact of COVID on women.
Yeah, I think this is the question or the conversation we need to have in 2020 around the gendered impacts of COVID-19 and really looking at it through an intersectional lens. So I'll say when the World Health Organization called COVID-19 a pandemic, many gender equity advocates knew that this would spell trouble for women and many other equity-seeking communities, because oftentimes what happens in pandemics and in any crisis, it deepens and entrenches some of the inequities that were present well before. And that's what we saw with COVID-19. So I want to kind of tell you a few things about the economic impact. I want to first begin with the fact, who was on the front lines of COVID response, right? In terms of the jobs, who held those occupations? It's overwhelmingly women. 70% of the global health workforce is comprised of women workers, but they only make up 25% of the leadership table, right? So again, we see this in many sectors in society, but it's really prevalent in health. Who is on the front lines and who gets to make the decisions. But because of who's on the front lines, women workers in those essential occupations, whether it's in care work or cleaning or cashiering, let's say at your local grocery store, they were also at risk of COVID-19. And not only were women workers on the front lines, they were also in the jobs that were most economically devastated by this crisis. So as Canada and different jurisdictions in Canada were going through lockdown measures, many of the sectors where women are overly represented, or women majority sectors as they're sometimes referred to. So I think about hospitality, tourism, food services, retail. When they shut down, women lost hours if they were working, hourly jobs, or they lost their complete, livelihood, right? So being laid off. And so many of those decisions and experiences that were happening in March and April in the early days of the pandemic, many of those jobs have not recovered, or if they have recovered, not in the same way. You're not going to the restaurant in the same way now, right now in October, like you were in February, right? And so we're seeing that economic loss. And the thing is, Canada has never seen a recession quite like this. Armine Yelnazine, she calls it the she session, and she often says that it's a she session, so we need a she recovery and we need childcare to, help take us back or rebuild. And I think that's really important to highlight, because oftentimes what happens in recessions is that there's a traditional playbook. Let's invest in infrastructure, let's invest in roads and bridges. But the thing is, because of where the job losses are, we need to center those sectors. So, either we need to build new jobs or invest in the sectors that we actually desperately need, like care work. And I'm sure in the conversations later today, we'll talk more. I do want to bring an example from the YWCA community. So we have a YWCA in Banff, which is a tourism center, a big tourism area in Canada. When the pandemic hit, 85% of the workforce in Banff lost their job. And oftentimes, their jobs, particularly in Banff, because it's the national park, is also tied to housing. So not only did workers lose their job, many of them women, but also their housing. So I think something we have to think about, and perhaps we don't always talk about this, and perhaps also Jessica will touch on this, is we need to also think about housing in this conversation on the economy, because it's interlinked, and there are clear impacts on both sectors. So I'll stop here, but really it's a very unique crisis to Canada, so we need a unique response. And that's what the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan starts the conversation about.
Yeah. And that sort of, like you said, existed for a long time, but really was brought to the forefront when COVID came. And so those inequities that we've been struggling with and saying things about really haven't been addressed. And so again, thank you for amplifying the voice of women on this, because it is going to shape what happens to women in the workforce as we move forward. So thank you for that. Jessica, the report speaks to the shadow pandemic, and you've been doing work on this. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And I think that speaking to the shadow pandemic is definitely a part of this conversation to which Anjum has started on, which was how COVID has exacerbated what's already been there, and that we've known that these things have existed long before COVID. And so the shadow pandemic, I think we can sometimes refer to that as the pandemic within the pandemic. And we've heard some of that language going around within the feminist violence against women sector and gender equity sector. But essentially, it's this worldwide and pervasive spread of gender-based violence, particularly intimate partner violence, sexual violence, femicide, and less common in Canada, but still definitely prevalent, honor killings. And so in an international context, I think that very, very early on in the pandemic, the UN had actually recognized the rise in the number of cases actually relating to gender-based violence. So any of the examples I had previously mentioned. And the pandemic, unfortunately, was a stressor, which caused a number of cases of gender-based violence to increase. So gender-based violence, as mentioned, existed before COVID. And as a result of COVID, it actually ended up increasing. And that's why we call it the pandemic within the pandemic, or the shadow pandemic, because it exists sort of in the shadows, isn't necessarily discussed at the forefront of addressing the COVID-19 crisis. And so what I do want to touch on in terms of the shadow pandemic and in terms of this rise in gender-based violence, which is the quarantine orders to stay in your home. And so these policies were brought forward as an attempt to limit the spread of the infectious disease. But I think that it demonstrates a really interesting point, and that is how gender neutral policies actually don't work the same for men as they do for women. And so when lockdown measures were put into place, what that actually meant was that a lot of women and girls were confined with their abusers, and they were disproportionately and probably unintentionally exposed to violence as a result. And so when we talk about gender-based violence in the context of COVID, what I think that we're really talking about here is how that policy of stay in your home, don't go out, limit your social interactions, how that sort of wide sweeping policy recommendation impacted women different than it did men. And so I think it also calls to the need for an intersectional approach to approach to the COVID-19 recovery strategy. Because if we know and we're recognizing that women are being disproportionately or differently impacted by COVID, then our response must also be, as Anjum has also said, unique. Just so I think to put the conversation into context a little bit, globally, there's about a 30% increase in the number of cases of gender-based violence, and a number of countries have reported this. Countries like all from France, Argentina, Germany, the UK, the US, and Canada. Canada is also one of those countries who have reported an increase. I can even say police services have also been able to verify this increase. I live in York Region, and unfortunately, York Region has also been able to suggest that they've had a doubling, and in some cases, a 30% increase in the number of domestic violence related calls as they've had in previous years. And so I think all in all, when we're thinking about the shadow pandemic, we need to think about how gender-based violence is actually an ongoing pandemic that has existed, again, pre-COVID, has been exacerbated as a result of COVID. But truly, I think that unfortunately, we do know how to address gender-based violence. We just lack the political, social, and sometimes personal will to be able to address it.
So for the life of me, I have never been able to understand how the work hours of 9 to 5 never really lined up with the school hours that ended at 2 or 3. It has never sat well with me. And now I can't imagine how women are working at home and having to day school children. I mean, it's difficult enough to work with a spouse in the house and, you're both on calls or whatever, but having to take care of children at the same time, that is another enormous challenge. And we know that this falls disproportionately on women to be responsible for. Anjum, can you talk to us a little bit about childcare? And maybe Jess, you can jump in as well.
Yeah, I think, as you were sharing, I was nodding my head because this is exactly the story of women from coast to coast to coast. What's interesting is before the pandemic, in the work that we do at YWCA, we're one of the largest nonprofit providers of childcare. And, we provide childcare, but it's not enough, right? There's so much need. People, oftentimes, sometimes, it's a joke, but sometimes it's honestly the reality. As soon as someone gets pregnant in the city of Toronto, I've heard you need to put yourself on a wait list for childcare. And it's expensive, right? Depending on how old the child is. And it can be almost the payment of a mortgage payment, right? So, even before the crisis, the cost was high, the quality was variable, and there just weren't enough spots. And now with this crisis, all of those variables have worsened, right? Even more expensive, even harder to get access to. And the thing is, the stock that we do have, which is already not enough, is at risk of closure. It's at risk of shuttering. Because a lot of the nonprofit providers, I'll say, the costs to actually deliver childcare have increased, right? Personal protective equipment, that costs money. Sometimes childcare centers were sitting in schools, right? And so they have to pay a cost for, let's say, rent. But with, reduction in parents paying or parent fees, so even the revenue streams have declined, but the expenses have increased. So it's the perfect storm, right? So we're really seeing by the end of December, hundreds, even thousands of childcare spots across the country at risk of disappearing.
Wow.
At the same time, we have seen how essentially the economy has grinded to a halt because childcare was not readily available, right? And I think this really shows two things. One, that this is such an essential part of our society. Why is it we did not have a proper system in place before? Because I think part of it is undervalued because it's primarily done by women. It's seen as feminized labor, and it is not given the respect it deserves. And for workers, very challenging working conditions, right? People are not paid appropriately for the incredible service they provide to society. So I think this is, some of the things around childcare that have been revealed, or, really there's a light that's been shone on this particular part of society. I also want to share that childcare is such a smart investment for so many reasons. So as we're thinking about the rebuild, one of the pieces of literature that we consulted, and an excellent institution in the UK, if folks haven't checked out, please do. It's called Women's Budget Group. So they do a lot of feminist budgeting, a lot of budgeting through like a gender lens. And they did, their analysis, and they found if the UK government invested only 2% of their GDP, so only 2% of their GDP in care, in the care economy. So a lot of that would be childcare. It could also be long-term care. They would create 1.5 million jobs.
Wow.
Just with 2% investment.
Wow.
And if they did the same type of investment in another sector, let's say construction, which is a men majority sector, they would create only half of that. So about 750,000. So 750,000. So it also shows childcare is very good for economic recovery as well, right? Or the care economy. So I think we're seeing childcare is such an engine for our economic progress. It's a job creator, and it ensures gender equality by ensuring all of us take part in this important work of care of children. So I'll leave it there, but just to say that the high key message is childcare is essential. We better start acting like it.
Just sort of on a last note on that, I think that without access to childcare, we're just not tapping into the full potential or capability of our workforce. That is, women make up 50% of our workforce. And if 50% of our workforce is being forced back into the private sphere, back into their homes, back into places of sort of traditional gender roles, we're not moving as quickly, and we're not advancing our economy as quickly as other countries who have invested 2% or 1% or 1.5% of their GDP into childcare. I always like to think of it in this type of analogy that it's like driving a car at 50 instead of 100 on a highway. You're destined for an accident. You're asking for danger. And so I think that we need to think about how fast we're moving in terms of investment and in terms of long-term growth when we're thinking about these things.
Yeah. And when we think about that in terms of the workforce, I really love that you pointed it, because I was going to say it too. Like if we're not investing in our workforce, and we're forcing them to stay at home and make choices about what's my priority here. It's either I pay for my kids' daycare or I pay for groceries, right? And then it also goes back to the type of work that women are encouraged, trained in to take on, right? And so we really need to be looking at changing all of these dynamics and systems that we encourage women to explore their fullest potential and contribute to their fullest. And daycare should not be a challenge or a barrier for them to achieve that. But there's so many other layers to that we need to be looking at. So, but in terms of, and I love the business case piece. And actually, I don't love it because it is not the first way we should be looking at it, but it seems to be the only way that we get through to decision makers when they see the way that it's going to change the revenues, right, and GDPs and all of that. So tax earnings and all of that. But we need to, and if we need to look at that analysis and make that case, that's important for us to do, because it's opportunities wasted in our economy, especially in one that pre-COVID, we were dying for people, shortage of skills, and we were forcing women to stay home when they're making those decisions. So important conversation. Let's continue here with the idea of what is at risk for women if we don't make some of these changes. We've seen really a rollback in women's career advancement. So what's at risk here?
So maybe I can begin and just start off by saying, and you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of, when it comes to gender equality, I will say no country in the world has achieved gender equality. Even some of the countries that are a bit more ahead, no country has achieved it. I think one of the challenges is, and within the Canadian context, for example, RBC Economics released that report this summer talking about the fact that women's labor market participation has dropped to levels not seen since the 1980s. So potentially 3 decades of rollback.
So I really want to hear from you in terms of how can we actually create an equitable space and level the playing field for women at home and in the workplace? That's a huge question. So it's okay if you just want to take an angle of that.
I can start. I, as a policy nerd, I definitely want to speak more so about the workplace and its role in promoting this, because I think a lot of when we talk about evening the playing field at home, a lot of it has to do with the normalization, socialization, like sort of bigger theories around women, the expectations for women and gender roles and such. But I see in the workplace that the way that we need to encourage or even the playing field for women boils down to 2 things. The first is policy, and the second is workplace culture. So when I say workplace policies, what I actually mean is that we need feminist workplace policies. And what I'm talking about more specifically is flexible work hours, offering childcare, extending sick or vacation days for parents so that when PA days come up, when March break comes up, when all these, your child wakes up sick one day, you're still able to work, but you're also able to care for your child. I'm also talking about flexible working arrangements, parental leave, ending, which I hope we do. I know this is a whole nother conversation, but ending the gig economy, where people are jumping from job to job, because that actually generates a lot of stress, which people are, particularly women, have to then carry the burden of trying to care for their child, but also find other employment as they're working full-time or part-time or whatever have you. And so providing folks with these types of policies on top of that, and ensuring that employment is full-time, we're more likely to even the playing ground, I feel, for more women in the workforce. I've also seen workplaces or I've been a part of inclusive workplaces that I thought that, wow, this is just brilliant. That when I've had colleagues who've had to run out in the middle of their day or their work day to pick up their child from school or address something at school. And so as a result, sometimes that colleague has had to bring their child into the office. Or, now we're living in a more virtual context, but you have kids running around in the background, or they're sitting in on meetings. And now, is that person being scrutinized as a result of those actions? Or are we normalizing it? Are we just saying, oh, that's just Jess's, child, and it's a part of our normal everyday work culture to see those things, to see kids sometimes in the workplace, because I've seen that as more and more women start to carry, or not start to carry, but continue to carry the burden of care, particularly childcare. We need to, I think, normalize seeing children in a workplace.
Yeah, no, I would agree with many of the things that you shared, Jessica. And I think, when I think about what I want to see as we move forward in this post-COVID workplace is really centering values like trust, centering values such as empathy. Because I think when we have those values, that results in a flexible workplace feeling not threatening. Because I think, a lot of advocates, especially in the disability justice movement and in feminist movements, have been calling for, remote work and flexible workplaces. But there's always this distrust, like, okay, if we let people work from home, will they actually do the work? And the thing is, people are actually working longer, right? People are working 12 hours right now. So I think, trust is a really important, place to start to push our workplaces. I think also around empathy. So, Jessica, you were describing, like, people play so many different roles in their life. And I think what we need is the workplace to start to work for people instead of the other way around. I don't know if this is a North American thing. My international colleagues tell me it's a North American thing where it's just go, 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 work, work, work. But to be honest, that's not all that we are, right? We're so many different dimensions to our personality, to who we are as humans. So I think we're going to hopefully see this decoupling of work from identity. At least that's my hope. And that's where I would like to kind of see us moving forward, because I think right now, if you're not offering that, people are going to leave. So I think for employers, it also becomes a matter of talent retention, starting to center trust and empathy in how they guide their workplace policies. I think the last thing I'll end on, and Jessica talked about this quite a bit, around how do we need to move away from individualized approaches to system levels approaches. Because the thing is, even for a workplace, let's say they want to do the right thing, we have to make the right thing the easy thing to do. So that's why we can't have, one workplace having one certain type of policy. We need to scale those promising practices. And the way we do that is through legislation. And I think a great example of this is paid sick leave. So, right now across the board, different companies offer different paid sick leave policies. And what we're seeing is in this crisis in particular, that's not something that should be discretionary. There should be a public societal value put on ensuring when people are sick, they stay at home, and they shouldn't fear losing wages. So I think that's just one example. But what we need to start to see is the promising practices that some employers are taking on. We need to scale that up through legislation. So I'll leave it there for now.
Before you leave us, I'd really like your advice for women as they try to reduce the impact of COVID, and not just COVID, but what happens when they're seeing losses in their own careers, right? Employers thinking, well, you have kids, I don't know what's happening with the school system, I don't know how reliable you're going to be. Talk to us about that. Give our women some advice as to how they could keep advancing in their careers.
I think that what women can do to sort of stay abreast with their careers is to address gaps in the resume, because I think that that's for a lot of employers are like, well, what did you do for the past 2 years? Is to address those gaps with volunteering. I think that's a very quick way to be able to commit in sort of a less of a full-time capacity, but to stay operating in a professional capacity. I've heard a lot of women talk about, I don't know if I can go back into the workforce, and they're scary. Like, this workforce is a beast on its own that you have to re-enter, or like it's a maze that you have to go through. But and so part of re-entering or staying into the workforce is staying into it, and whether it be in a formal capacity, or whether it be in an informal capacity, the opportunities are there. Or I would also recommend a sort of staying involved or furthering your education. I think that while if you have the opportunity to, but just it's an option to while you may not be employed full time, school is definitely an option, and there's lots of flexible degrees that are available nowadays where you can access further education and learn a new skill, or build on an existing skill set to be able to still to address gaps that you may have, or to stay up to date with the workforce. I think sometimes going back to school and sort of doing a refresher is a really great thing. And networking. I can't tell you the countless amount of women that I've met at networking events that are like, I'm just trying to get back into the workforce, and I've been on maternity leave for 8 months, and I'm going to go back soon, or 9 months soon. And so, networking is also a really good way to be able to connect with people and get kind of wedge your way right back into a professional capacity.
So I was going to suggest 3 things. So first is relationships, really leaning into your connections that you had before this crisis. So both of you lovely ladies, I knew before the crisis, and it's been so great to reconnect and just share. I think it's harder to do now that we're all at home. So I'd say really to people listening, push yourselves to continue that connection with people you probably would have naturally, seen at an event or, maybe cross paths on the street. It's harder to have those spontaneous moments of connection. So you actually have to work at it. You have to create that schedule or really put that structure in, but you will get incredible dividends, like Jessica was saying, around networking. I would also say lean into the relationships that you have at work, because I think one of the challenges during this time, and again, it goes back because that informal conversations are not present, people need to over communicate at this time, because there is the potential for misunderstandings and conversations not fully translating across, a Zoom screen. So I think that in a way is also something to think about, even as you're thinking about promotions, right? Like, what is your presence, right? It's harder to do that virtually, but investing in your relationships will ensure that you can have that connection. And I think part of connection, in a way, is building power. And this comes from civic engagement, because when you think about relationships, it's this exchange of knowledge, it's this exchange of perspective, and then also a potential to persuade. And the more people you can have that one-on-one conversation with, the more you can start to build that momentum for the change you want to see. So if there's something that is not working, for example, in your school board, and your kids are, you're friends with the parents of the kids in the classroom that your child is in, then you can also, come together and do collective action, right? And that's just one example. But I think as we move forward, the challenges, and Jessica talked about this, is we can't necessarily solve all of our concerns through individualized approaches. It is through that systems level piece. But at the core of that systems level change is relationships, right? That's how you get people on side and build that momentum and civic engagement to create that change for public policy. So I guess the final thing I'll say is definitely focus on the interpersonal and the organizational change that needs to happen, but don't lose your picture on the bigger systems at play, the forces at play, because many of the changes that we're all seeking, that we have talked about in this conversation, many of them do require that public policy lever. But part of the way to get there is through those one-on-one interactions, one-on-one conversations. So I think, investing in relationships at the core with that bigger picture in mind can create the future we are all kind of hoping for and pushing for together.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And so there's also, to your point, Jessica, about learning opportunities, there are so many free ones as well that people can check out. I know the Career Foundation has a listing of those for people to take advantage of. And so definitely people can go to our website to learn about that. But there are all kinds of workshops. There's online volunteer opportunities. Getting involved in different things, will also build your portfolio and skill set and network, and teach you how to have relationships in a virtual world. And so that all kind of goes together. So thank you so much for that. I think it's important for women to recognize that we often underestimate ourselves. You've all heard that men tend to apply for jobs where they see their potential, and women tend to apply for jobs where they have done it already and showed experience. And really want to challenge women out there to look at your potential. I love the Career Foundation's tagline that we develop human potential. I really believe in that. And that's what we're meant to be doing, even as individuals, is developing our potential. And so see the potential in yourself and, apply for those opportunities as well. So I want to thank you both, ladies, for sharing these important insights with us. It's clear that there's a lot that needs to be done. But as we try to build back better, as you say, we need to make sure that we're doing it fairly and inclusively. And so it is my hope that these sessions will sort of illuminate opportunities for us to truly create that equitable space. And we've seen in some, examples where we create equality for one group. It helps equality for everyone. It helps, build a better world for everyone. And if that could actually be what our challenge, our daily challenge, and what we constantly strive for, I think we'll be able to build something better and, use that tipping point in a positive way to move us forward. So again, with that, I want to thank you, Anjum and Jessica, for joining me. And thanks everyone for listening. Stay tuned to our next episode at Future at Work as we focus on disability inclusion in the workplace. Don't forget to visit our website, thecareerfoundation.com, and follow us on social media. Stay safe, everyone, and be well.
Thanks for tuning in to the Career Foundation's Future at Work podcast and web series. To learn more about our workforce development initiatives, visit our website at www.careerfoundation.com and follow us on social media. To listen to our previous episodes, subscribe to the Future at Work podcast on iTunes or Spotify.